At the gates of an ancient city, a creature with the body of a lion and the face of a woman stops every traveler. She has one question: get it wrong, and you never leave. Welcome to Shadow Folklore. Today, the Sphinx, the road to Thebes, runs through dry hills, where the stone remembers heat long after the sun has set. Dust settles in the creases of every surface. The air tastes of limestone and wild thyme. In the hours before dawn, when the stars are still sharp overhead and the eastern horizon holds only the faintest promise of grey, the path narrows. Rocky outcrops press in from either side. The travelers, merchants with laden donkeys, messengers on foot, pilgrims seeking the oracle, farmers bringing grain to market, must pass single file through a natural gate where the cliffs lean toward one another, like the jaws of some ancient mechanism designed to swallow the unwary. It is here. It's the scent of the plain. The traveler's sandals crunch on gravel that should not be there. Fragments of bone, pale and small, scattered across the path like discarded dice. And then, perched on the boulder that commands the narrowest point of the pass, wings folded against a body too large to be merely human, too deliberate to be merely beast, sits the Sphinx. She does not move when the traveler approaches. Her eyes, dark and utterly still, watch with her human face is beautiful in the way that statues are beautiful, perfect and pitiless. The lion's body beneath is tawny and scarred, powerful haunches tensed, as though she might spring at any moment, though she never does. Not yet. The wings, vast and feathered, shift. Always the question. The same words, posed to every soul who seeks to enter Thebes. And for those who answer incorrectly, and nearly all answer incorrectly, there is no second chance. There is only the sudden lunge, the claws, the tearing, and then silence. Another set of bones to join the gravel. Another traveler who will never reach the city gates. This is the Sphinx of Greek legend. Not a riddle written in a children's book, not a monument half, buried in desert sand, but a killer, a devourer, a guardian who demands the price of knowledge, and whose patience is as infinite as the morning she haunts. The creature that held the approach to Thebes in a grip of terror emerged from a culture that understood the world as a place of thresholds. Ancient Greece, particularly the city-states of the classical period, existed in a landscape where wilderness and civilization pressed against one another in uneasy proximity. Thebes itself, the principal city of Boeotia in central Greece, sat on a plateau ringed by mountains, Cithaeron to the south, Tumessus to the north and east. These were not the gentle hills of pastoral poetry. They were rugged, broken country where wolves still hunted, and where the boundary between the ordered world of the polis and the untamed realm beyond was never more than a few hours' walk away. The people of Thebes, like all Greeks of the archaic and classical eras, inhabited a cosmos thick with divine presence. Their gods were not distant. They walked the earth. They intervened in human affairs. They punished hubris, rewarded piety, and sometimes destroyed mortals for reasons that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the tangled, vindictive politics of Olympus. The Thebans traced their city's founding to Cadmus, a Phoenician prince who had followed a cow to the site and killed a dragon sacred to Ares, sowing its teeth in the ground. From those teeth sprang the Spartoi, the sown men ancestors of Thebes' noble families. The city was born, in other words, from an act of violence against the sacred, and it never forgot that origin. Its mythology is soaked in blood. Oedipus, Antigone, the seven against Thebes, the wars between brothers, the curses that echo across generations. In this world, monsters were not metaphors. They were real dangers, sent by gods or born from primordial chaos, and they served specific functions in the divine economy. Some guarded treasures, some punished the wicked. Some simply existed as tests, obstacles that heroes had to overcome to prove themselves worthy. The Sphinx belonged to this latter category, though her purpose was more complex than simple obstruction. She was a liminal creature, a being of the threshold. She appeared at the boundary between the wild and the civilized, between ignorance and knowledge, between life and death. To pass her was to prove not strength of arm but strength of mind. She was, in the most literal sense, a gatekeeper of wisdom. The geography of her haunting matters. The pass outside Thebes, where tradition places her, would have been a natural choke point. the kind of terrain where a single defender could hold off many. Travelers approaching from the south, from Attica or the Peloponnese, would have had to climb through the foothills of Cithaeron, a mountain range already heavy with myth. Cithaeron was where Pentheus was torn apart by Maenads, where the infant Oedipus was left to die with his ankles pierced, where Actaeon was transformed into a stag and devoured by his own hounds for seeing Artemis bathe. It was a landscape of transformation and punishment, a place where the rules of the everyday world did not fully apply. That the Sphinx made her lair on the approaches to Thebes, in this ambiguous terrain, was no accident. She belonged there, in the space between. The ancient Greeks lived with a constant awareness of boundaries, between citizen and foreigner, Greek and barbarian, man and woman, mortal and divine. To cross a boundary without the proper knowledge, the proper ritual, the proper words, was to invite disaster. The Sphinx embodied this principle. She was the question you had to answer before you could proceed. She was the test of whether you possessed the wisdom necessary to enter the city, to participate in civilized life. Fail, and you were revealed as unworthy, still part of the wild world she represented, fit only to be consumed and forgotten. The Sphinx of Thebes is described with remarkable consistency across ancient sources, though variations exist in emphasis and detail. At her core, she is a hybrid creature combining the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head and upper torso of a woman. The Greek term sphinx likely derives from the verb sphingein, meaning to bind or to strangle, though this etymology is debated. What is certain is that her physical form represents a fusion of the regal, the predatory, and the human intelligence married to lethal power, and granted the freedom of flight. Hesiod's Theogony, composed around 700 BCE, places the Sphinx in a genealogy of monsters. She is the daughter of Echidna, the half-woman, half-serpent monster who dwelt in a cave in Arima, and either Typhon, the 100-headed storm giant who nearly overthrew Zeus, or Orthus, the two-headed dog that guarded the cattle of Geryon. This makes her sister to the Nemean lion, the Linnaean hydra, and the chimera, a family of creatures designed to test and destroy heroes. The playwright Sophocles, in his fragmentary work Oenomas, describes her as having the face of a maiden, the breast and feet and tail of a lion, and the wings of a bird. Later sources, including the Scholia on Euripides and various mythographers, add details. Her eyes are unblinking. Her voice is described sometimes as melodious, sometimes as harsh, and her intelligence is repeatedly emphasized, as far exceeding that of ordinary beasts. But there are variations. Some accounts give her the tail of a serpent rather than a lion, linking her more closely to her mother Echidna and emphasizing her chthonic, earth-born nature. Others describe her with a human face, but the body entirely of a lion, wings notwithstanding, making her less a composite creature and more a leonine being with a stolen human visage. A few late sources mention her having multiple heads, or the ability to shift her appearance, though these are outliers and likely represent confusion with other monsters, or attempts to rationalize contradictory descriptions. What remains constant is her method. She does not hunt. She does not chase. She waits, perched on a high rock or the peak of a crag. She allows travelers to come to her. When they arrive, she poses her riddle. The question is famous, preserved in multiple ancient texts with only minor variations. What creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? The answer, of course, is man, crawling as an infant, walking upright as an adult, leaning on a cane in old age. It is a riddle about the human life cycle, about the inevitable progression from helplessness to strength to decline. It is also a riddle about self-knowledge, about the ability to see oneself clearly across the span of time. Those who fail to answer correctly, and according to the myths, everyone failed until Oedipus arrived, were killed immediately. The manner of death varies slightly by source. Some say she strangled her victims, living up to the etymological meaning of her name. Others say she tore them apart with her lion's claws and devoured them. Still others describe her seizing victims in her talons and dashing them against the rocks. Apollodorus, writing in the 1st or 2nd century CE, states simply that she carried them off and devoured them. suggesting she took the bodies elsewhere to consume them. What all accounts agree on is that no one survived an incorrect answer. The Sphinx was not a teacher offering second chances. She was an executioner. Her physical abilities are implied rather than exhaustively catalogued. The wings suggest she could fly, though no myth depicts her in aerial pursuit. Her power lay in her immobility, her command of the threshold, not in chasing the fleeing. Her lion's strength is assumed. No mortal could hope to overpower her physically. Some later traditions give her a hypnotic gaze, or a voice that compels honesty, though these are not present in the earliest sources. What she possessed, above all, was knowledge. She knew the riddle, and she knew that almost no one could answer it. She was secure in her superiority, in her role as the unchallengeable guardian, right up until the moment she was challenged successfully. No source attributes to her any particular weakness beyond the obvious. Solve the riddle, and her power ends. She has no Achilles heel, no secret vulnerability. She is defeated entirely through intellect, which makes her fundamentally different from monsters like the Hydra or the Minotaur, creatures that required brute force and cunning to overcome. The Sphinx required only wisdom. And when that wisdom finally arrived in the person of Oedipus, she had no defense. The origin story of the Sphinx's presence at Thebes is itself a tale of divine punishment and cosmic imbalance. According to the most common tradition, the creature was sent to plague Thebes as retribution for a crime committed by the city's king, Laius. The nature of that crime varies by source, but the most widely accepted version involves Laius's abduction and rape of Chrysippus, the young son of King Pelops, while Laius was in exile in Elis. This act of sexual violence against a youth violated the sacred bonds of xenia, guest, friendship, and introduced a new kind of transgression into the world. Some traditions hold that Laius's crime was the first instance of homosexual rape in Greek mythology, a violation so profound that the gods themselves could not ignore it. The question of which god sent the Sphinx is disputed. Hera, queen of the gods and protector of marriage, is named by several sources as the one who dispatched the monster to punish Thebes for harboring and honoring a man who had committed such an outrage. Her choice of instrument makes a certain cruel sense. The Sphinx, with her woman's face and predatory nature, becomes a dark mirror of violated innocence transformed into lethal judgment. Other accounts attribute the sending to Ares, god of war, still angry over the slaying of his dragon by Cadmus generations earlier, or to Dionysus, whose worship Thebes had resisted. A few late sources suggest the Sphinx was sent by Apollo, god of knowledge and prophecy, as a test of the city's wisdom, though this sits uneasily with the creature's role as a plague rather than a challenge. Regardless of who sent her, the Sphinx's presence transformed Thebes into a city under siege. No one could enter or leave without facing her riddle. Trade ceased, communication with the outside world was severed. The bones of the failed accumulated at the pass, a grim monument to the city's helplessness. The situation grew so desperate that the Thebans, according to Apollodorus and others, offered the kingship itself and the hand of the widowed Queen Jocasta to anyone who could rid them of the monster. This was no small offer. Thebes was one of the great cities of Greece, and its throne carried immense prestige. That the Thebans were willing to give it to a stranger, to anyone who could solve a riddle, speaks to their desperation. The arrival of Oedipus is the pivot point of the myth. He was not a Theban. He had been raised in Corinth, believing himself the son of King Polybus, and was fleeing a prophecy delivered by the oracle at Delphi, a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Attempting to outrun fate, he had taken the road toward Thebes. On the way, at a place where three roads met, he had encountered an old man in a chariot who tried to force him off the path. A quarrel erupted. Oedipus, young and hot-tempered, struck the old man and killed him along with most of his attendants. The old man was Laius, Oedipus's true father, though neither knew it. The prophecy had already begun to unfold. When Oedipus reached the approaches to Thebes and encountered the Sphinx, he was still simply a traveler, a young man of apparent noble bearing, but no particular renown. She posed her riddle, and Oedipus, whose name means swollen foot, a reference to the wounds inflicted when he was exposed as an infant, answered correctly. Man, he said. The creature that crawls on 4 legs in infancy, walks on 2 in adulthood, and leans on a cane in old age is man. It is a riddle about the self. And Oedipus, who did not yet know his own true identity, who did not know he was the son of the man he had just killed, and would soon marry the man's widow, his own mother, answered with perfect clarity. The Sphinx's reaction to her defeat is one of the most striking elements of the entire myth. She did not fight. She did not attempt to kill Oedipus, despite having the physical power to do so. At all major sources, she threw herself from the cliff and died. Apollodorus states it simply, Diodorus Siculus, Pausanias, and others repeat the same detail. The monster, her riddle answered, and her purpose thereby nullified, chose self-destruction over continued existence in a world where she had been bested. This is not typical behavior for Greek monsters. The Hydra did not kill itself when Heracles began cutting off its heads. The Minotaur did not fling itself from the walls of its labyrinth when Theseus arrived with Ariadne's thread. Monsters in Greek mythology fight to the end, resist their killers, die violently at the hands of heroes. The Sphinx is unique in that she administers her own death, and she does so immediately upon being defeated in the realm of knowledge. There is something profoundly tragic in this. The creature whose entire identity rested on possessing a question that could not be answered, whose power derived from the impossibility of her riddle, could not endure the revelation that she was fallible. Her suicide is the suicide of absolute certainty confronted with its own limits. The symbolism embedded in the Sphinx myth operates on multiple levels. On the most immediate, she represents the danger of the threshold, the peril that waits at every boundary between the known and unknown. To enter a city, to cross from one state of being to another, requires that you demonstrate worthiness. The riddle tests not strength or speed or courage, but wisdom and self-knowledge. It is a fundamentally intellectual challenge, and its solution is a recognition of the human condition: birth, maturity, decline, death. Oedipus's ability to answer the riddle demonstrates that he possesses the wisdom to rule, which is precisely what the Thebans offer him as reward. But the deeper irony, of course, is that Oedipus has no self-knowledge whatsoever. He can answer a riddle about the general nature of human life, but he does not know his own parentage, his own identity, his own fate. He is the man of insight who is blind to himself, and this blindness will destroy him. By the end of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, he will blind himself literally, taking pins from his mother, wife's dress, and driving them into his eyes, transforming metaphorical blindness into physical mutilation. The Sphinx's riddle is thus both his triumph and a cruel joke. He knows what man is, but he does not know who he is. The Sphinx also functions as a guardian of forbidden knowledge. Thebes, the city she besieges, is a place of dark secrets. Laius's crime, the curse on the house of Cadmus, the incest and patricide that are about to unfold. The Sphinx stands at the gate, demanding wisdom of those who would enter. But the wisdom she demands is paradoxically the wisdom that will lead Oedipus into catastrophe. To pass the Sphinx is to enter a world of terrible truths. In this reading, she is not merely an obstacle, but a warning, a final chance to turn back before crossing into a realm of knowledge that destroys. Her death is equally symbolic. When the riddle is answered, when the mystery is solved, the Sphinx ceases to have meaning. She is the embodiment of the unanswerable question, and once answered, she cannot continue. Her suicide is the death of the enigma itself, the collapse of mystery into mere fact. It is also, perhaps, an act of defiance. She will not be subjugated, will not serve or flee or adapt. She existed for one purpose, and when that purpose is negated, she chooses oblivion. There is a kind of terrible integrity in this, a refusal to compromise or survive in diminished form. The Greek Sphinx stands in stark contrast to her Egyptian counterpart, though the two are often confused in popular imagination. The Great Sphinx of Giza, carved from limestone and standing guard near the pyramids, is a monument to stability, not menace. With the body of a lion and the head of a pharaoh, likely Khafre, though this is debated, it represents royal power and divine protection. It does not pose riddles, it does not kill. It reclines in eternal watchfulness, a symbol of kingship and cosmic order. The Egyptian Shasepi or Shasep, Ankh, meaning living image, served as a guardian of sacred spaces, particularly tombs and temples, but its function was apotropaic, warding off evil, not presenting intellectual challenges to passers-by. The Greek adoption and transformation of the Egyptian form is a fascinating example of cultural borrowing and reinterpretation. Greek travelers and mercenaries had extensive contact with Egypt beginning in the 7th century BCE, and images of sphinxes, both male and female, appear in Greek art from this period onward. But where the Egyptian Sphinx was benevolent, or at least neutral, the Greek imagination transformed it into something deadly. The Greeks added wings, changed the gender to exclusively female in most depictions, and gave her a voice, a riddle, a specific malevolence. She became not a protector but a destroyer, not a symbol of order but of chaos, constrained only by the narrow terms of her own challenge. This transformation reflects a deeper difference in worldview. Egyptian religion emphasized Ma'at, cosmic order, and the Sphinx embodied that principle, permanence, stability, the endurance of the pharaoh's power beyond death. Greek religion, by contrast, was deeply concerned with boundaries, transgressions, and the unpredictable interventions of capricious gods. The Greek Sphinx is sent as punishment, exists to kill, and is ultimately destroyed. She is temporary, contingent, an aberration that must be overcome rather than a permanent feature of the landscape, where the Egyptian Sphinx says, "This shall endure." The Greek Sphinx says, "Prove you are worthy to pass, or die." The confusion between the two sphinxes has ancient roots. By the Roman period, writers sometimes conflated them or described the Greek Sphinx as having traveled from Egypt, adding to her exotic mystique. But the creatures serve fundamentally different purposes in their respective mythologies. One guards the eternal, the other guards a single city for a single span of time. And when her purpose is fulfilled, she dies. The differences matter. The first extended treatment of the Sphinx in Greek literature appears in fragmentary form in the works of Hesiod, circa 700 BCE, who provides her monstrous genealogy, but not the story of Oedipus. The riddle itself is not explicitly recorded in any surviving text from the Archaic period, though it was clearly part of oral tradition. The first detailed literary account of Oedipus's encounter with the Sphinx likely appeared in the lost epic Oedipidia, composed sometime in the 6th century BCE, of which only a few lines survive. Pindar, writing in the 5th century BCE, alludes to the Sphinx in his odes, describing her as the maiden of the crooked talons. The story reached its canonical form in the tragedies of Sophocles, particularly Oedipus Rex, first performed around 429 BCE. Sophocles does not depict the riddle scene directly. His play begins after Oedipus has already solved the riddle, married Jocasta, and ruled Thebes for years. But it is the foundation for everything that follows. The riddle and its answer are mentioned in dialogue, and the Sphinx's defeat is recalled as Oedipus's great triumph, the act that proved his wisdom and earned him the throne. The irony is laid bare in the play's climactic moments, when Oedipus, who solved the riddle about the nature of man, discovers the truth about himself, and realizes he is the pollution, the curse, the source of the plague devastating Thebes. Apollodorus of Athens, writing his Bibliotheca or library in the 1st or 2nd century CE, provides one of the most complete prose accounts of the Sphinx episode. He describes her sitting on Mount Fisham, posing her riddle to passers-by and devouring those who failed to answer. He records the riddle in the form most familiar today, and specifies that the Sphinx threw herself from the citadel upon hearing the correct answer. This account became the standard reference for later writers, who drew on it for details. But before we follow the Sphinx into the realm of outside observers and modern reinterpretation, it is worth pausing on one final aspect of the original myth. What exactly did the Thebans think they were dealing with? The answer is not as simple as a monster sent by the gods. The Sphinx occupied a specific category in Greek thought. She was a teres, a portent, a monstrous sign sent to communicate divine displeasure. But she was also paideia, a teacher, albeit a lethal one. Her riddle was educational, a lesson about human nature delivered at the cost of life itself. And she was a daemon, a spirit, or power, neither fully mortal nor fully divine, operating according to rules set by higher powers, but possessing her own agency within those constraints. This makes her profoundly ambiguous. She is evil, certainly, from the perspective of her victims, but she is also performing a function, fulfilling a role assigned to her. When that role is completed, when someone answers the riddle, she does not become a rogue element wreaking further havoc. She exits the story cleanly, by her own hand. There is almost a tragic dignity in this, a sense that the Sphinx understood the terms of her own existence and accepted them fully, including their end. The outside world's encounter with the Greek Sphinx came primarily through the lens of Roman interpretation. As Rome absorbed Greek culture and transmitted it across the Mediterranean and into Europe, Roman poets and mythographers encountered the story of Oedipus and the Sphinx as part of the larger Theban cycle, which included the seven against Thebes and Antigone's defiance. Roman writers tended to emphasize the riddle itself as a display of cleverness, rather than exploring the deeper cosmological implications of the encounter. Ovid, writing his Metamorphoses in the early 1st century CE, mentions the Sphinx only briefly, but Seneca the Younger, in his tragedy Oedipus, composed around 50 CE, gives considerable attention to the creature and her riddle. Seneca's version is darker and more psychologically focused than Sophocles', dwelling on pollution, guilt, and cosmic horror. His Sphinx is described in terms that emphasize her hybrid monstrosity, part virgin, part beast, part bird, a violation of natural categories. For a Roman audience increasingly influenced by Stoic philosophy and its emphasis on reason, the Sphinx became a symbol of irrational chaos, overcome by rational thought. The medieval and Renaissance periods saw the Sphinx largely neglected in favor of other classical monsters. She appears occasionally in bestiaries and encyclopedias, but usually conflated with the Egyptian Sphinx, or treated as a decorative element rather than a living part of myth. Dante does not include her in the Inferno, though he includes the Minotaur, Harpies, and Geryon. Boccaccio's Genealogia Diorum Gentilium, a 14th century compendium of classical mythology, discusses her briefly in the context of Oedipus, but offers little original interpretation. It was not until the 19th century, with the rise of philology, archaeology, and psychoanalysis, that the Sphinx re-emerged as a figure of intense scholarly interest. The decipherment of hieroglyphics and the excavation of Egyptian monuments brought the Great Sphinx of Giza into European consciousness, and scholars worked to disentangle the Greek and Egyptian traditions. Georg Friedrich Kreuzer's symbolic und Mythologie der alten Völker 1810–1812 argued that the Greek Sphinx was a degraded version of an originally Egyptian symbol of wisdom, a thesis that proved influential despite its shaky foundations. The real transformation came with Sigmund Freud, in his The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899, and subsequent works. Freud read the Oedipus myth, and by extension the Sphinx, through the lens of psychoanalysis. For Freud, Oedipus's encounter with the Sphinx represented the confrontation with the unconscious, the moment where repressed knowledge forces its way into consciousness. The riddle about the stages of human life becomes a riddle about sexual development, about the child's recognition of generational succession and mortality. The Sphinx herself becomes a maternal figure, both alluring and deadly, whose riddle encodes the primal mystery of where children come from and what it means to grow up. Freudian interpretation dominated 20th century readings of the Sphinx for decades. Carl Jung offered an alternative view, seeing the Sphinx as an archetype of the anima, the feminine aspect of the male psyche, and her riddle as a test of psychological integration. These psychoanalytic readings, whatever their merits, share a common limitation. They treat the Sphinx as a symbol, a figure in a dream, rather than as a creature with her own narrative existence. They reduce her to a function in Oedipus's story, erasing her own subjectivity and her own tragedy. Feminist scholars beginning in the 1970s began to reclaim the Sphinx, reading her as a figure of female power and knowledge destroyed by patriarchal heroism. In this interpretation, the Sphinx's suicide is not dignified but tragic, the self-destruction of a woman who has internalized the message that her value lies solely in her invincibility and who cannot survive her own defeat. Others have read her as a guardian of pre-patriarchal mysteries, a relic of an older order overthrown by the rise of male-dominated city-states. These readings are speculative, often anachronistic, but they restore to the Sphinx a certain agency, a sense that her story matters beyond its function in Oedipus's arc. From the 19th century onward, travelers, scholars, and archaeologists also documented the physical remains associated with the Sphinx myth. While the creature herself left no fossil record, the landscape of her haunting does exist. The approaches to ancient Thebes, particularly the passes through Mount Cithaeron, have been surveyed and mapped. The site known as the Sphinxion, a precinct outside Thebes where the Sphinx was said to have sat, was mentioned by Pausanias in his 2nd century CA description of Greece. He records that the Thebans maintained a small sanctuary there, though whether in honor or propitiation of the creature is unclear. In 1887, the French archaeologist Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville attempted to identify the exact location of the Sphinx's cliff, correlating Pausanias' account with the topography of the Theban plain. His conclusions, published in memoirs concerning the ancient geography of Thebes, placed the site near the southern approaches to the ancient city, where a natural outcrop of rock would have provided a commanding view of the road. While d'Anville's work has been superseded by more modern surveys, his insistence on treating the myth as rooted in real geography reflects a broader 19th century impulse to rationalize classical legends. No excavation has ever uncovered bones of the Sphinx's victims, and none should be expected. The accumulation of bones at the pass is narrative detail, a way of conveying the creature's long tenure and high body count, not a claim about physical evidence. But the landscape itself, the narrow defiles, the rocky crags, the sense of passing through a natural gate remains. To walk the approaches to the site of ancient Thebes today is to understand, at least in topographical terms, why this place became the setting for a story about a guardian who controls passage. The most significant documented case of the Sphinx in the historical record is not a sighting or an encounter, but the persistence of the myth itself across centuries of Greek and Roman culture. The story of Oedipus and the Sphinx was performed in theaters across the Greek world. It was referenced in political speeches, inscribed on pottery, depicted in sculpture and painting. The Sphinx appeared on Corinthian and Attic vase paintings from the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, often shown perched on a column or rock with a human figure standing before her, Oedipus, though not always named. These images are not evidence of the Sphinx's physical existence, but they are evidence of the myth's cultural power, its ability to resonate across generations as a story about wisdom, self-knowledge, and the price of ignorance. In 1888, the German archaeologist Ernst Curtius, working at Thebes, uncovered a fragmentary relief from a 5th century BCE stele, depicting a winged figure with a woman's head and a lion's body. The relief was damaged, and the inscription accompanying it was fragmentary, but Curtius identified it as a representation of the Sphinx and argued that it came from a local shrine or memorial. The finding was reported in the Mythologen des Deutschen Archäologischen Instituts, and the relief is now housed in the Thebes Archaeological Museum. While the relief is certainly a Sphinx, whether it represents the specific Sphinx of the Oedipus myth or simply uses the Sphinx as a decorative motif remains a matter of scholarly debate. More recently, in 1952, the Greek archaeologist Nikolaos Platon excavated a site near ancient Thebes that yielded several archaic period figurines depicting Sphinx-like creatures. These figurines, made of terracotta and dating to approximately 600 BCE, show variations in form, some with human faces, some more leonine, some with elaborate wings. Platon argued in his report to the Greek Archaeological Society that the variety of forms suggested a living tradition of Sphinx imagery, one that artists adapted and reimagined, rather than slavishly copying from a single canonical model. This supports the idea that the Sphinx was not a rigidly defined figure in Greek thought, but a flexible symbol, a composite creature whose exact features could vary while retaining core elements of woman, lion, and wings. The question of whether anyone in ancient Greece believed the Sphinx had literally existed is more complex than it might appear. Greek attitudes toward their own myths were varied and sophisticated. Educated Greeks of the classical period, influenced by philosophers like Xenophanes and Heraclitus, who criticized anthropomorphic depictions of the gods, often treated myths as allegories or symbolic narratives rather than historical accounts. Thucydides, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, famously dismissed poets and mythographers as unreliable sources, arguing that true history required eyewitness testimony and verifiable evidence. Yet even skeptical Greeks did not wholly reject the mythological past. They recognized a distinction between the age of heroes and the age of men, accepting that the world of Heracles, Theseus, and Oedipus operated under different rules than their own time. The Sphinx belonged to that heroic age, a period when gods walked the earth and monsters plagued mankind. Whether she was literally real or symbolically true was, for many Greeks, a less important question than what her story meant. The Roman period brought a more rationalized approach. Plutarch in his Moralia discusses the Sphinx as an allegory of political tyranny or social disorder, suggesting that Oedipus's victory represents the triumph of wise governance over chaotic misrule. Palaphaetus, in his treatise on unbelievable tales from the 4th century BCE, offers a rationalized explanation. The Sphinx, he argues, was not a monster but a bandit named Sphinx, who controlled the mountain passes and posed riddles to travelers, killing those who failed. This interpretation drains the story of its supernatural elements while preserving the core narrative structure, a common strategy in ancient euhemerism, the reduction of myths to exaggerated accounts of historical events. By late antiquity, Christian writers encountered the Sphinx primarily as a pagan symbol, and they treated her with suspicion or outright hostility. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the late 2nd century, mentions the Sphinx in passing as an example of the absurdities of pagan mythology. A monster whose riddle is trivial compared to the mysteries of Christian faith. Augustine of Hippo does not discuss the Sphinx directly, but his broader dismissal of pagan myths as lies invented by demons set the tone for centuries of Christian interpretation. Yet the Sphinx never entirely disappeared. She was too useful, too symbolically rich, to be wholly suppressed. Medieval and Renaissance Christian scholars preserved the Oedipus story because it appeared in Seneca and other Latin texts that formed part of the classical curriculum. The Sphinx became a symbol of earthly wisdom, clever but ultimately inferior to divine revelation. She was the riddle that human reason could solve. In this domesticated form, stripped of her terror and her divinity, she survived into the early modern period. The Sphinx entered Western popular culture, not as a living legend, but as a decorative motif and a literary reference. In the visual arts, particularly during the neoclassical period of the 18th and 19th centuries, sphinxes appeared as ornamental elements in architecture and garden design, flanking entrances or adorning fountains. These decorative sphinxes drew more from Egyptian than Greek tradition, emphasizing serene monumentality rather than lethal intelligence. The Great Sphinx of Giza, made famous by Napoleon's Egyptian campaign of 1798, phase of 1899, and the subsequent publication of Description DL Fegypti 1809 Fe 1829, became the dominant image, overshadowing the Greek man, eater of Thebes. In literature, the Sphinx appears in Edgar Allan Poe's 1846 short story, The Sphinx, though in a form utterly divorced from Greek myth. Poe's Sphinx is a small insect viewed through a window that, due to a trick of perspective, appears enormous and terrifying. The story is about misperception and psychological projection, and the title invokes the classical Sphinx only as a marker of mystery and terror, not as a character or active element. This casual referencing, using the Sphinx as a symbol or metaphor, rather than engaging with the actual myth, would characterize much of her later literary appearances. The late 19th century saw a revival of interest in Greek tragedy, and with it, a renewed engagement with the Oedipus myth and the Sphinx. In 1885, the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne published The Sphinx, a long poem that treats the creature not as a character, but as an abstract force, a personification of inscrutability and time. The poem is technically impressive, but emotionally distant, more concerned with demonstrating classical erudition than with inhabiting the myth. A far more influential work appeared in 1894, Oscar Wilde's prose poem, The Sphinx. Wilde's Sphinx is a creature of decadence and ancient mystery, addressed by a speaker who both desires and fears her. The poem catalogues her monstrous lovers and mates, Amun, Memphian gods, creatures of the Nile, blending Egyptian and Greek imagery into a rich, perfumed evocation of forbidden knowledge and perverse sexuality. Wilde's Sphinx is not the Riddler of Thebes, but a broader symbol of the allure and danger of the ancient world, the seductive power of paganism and the forbidden. The poem ends with the speaker rejecting the Sphinx, sending her back to the desert. But the rejection feels hollow, a failed attempt to escape her influence. Wilde's treatment is less about the myth itself than about the late Victorian fascination with the exotic and the transgressive. But it cemented the Sphinx's place in modern literary consciousness as a figure of enigmatic, dangerous femininity. The 20th century brought the Sphinx into psychoanalysis, as discussed earlier, and also into genre fiction. In 1943, the mystery novelist Ngaio Marsh published A Surfeit of Suspects, a novel in which a character describes a murder victim as having met his Sphinx again, a casual invocation of the myth as a metaphor for an unsolvable problem. More substantive engagement came in fantasy literature. In 1951, C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe included creatures that, while not sphinxes explicitly, drew on the same tradition of composite beasts with human intelligence and predatory instincts. The Sphinx as a specific character in genre fiction appears prominently in Piers Anthony's 1987 novel Sphinx, part of the Xanth series. Anthony's version is a female Sphinx who guards a mountain pass and poses riddles to travelers, clearly modeled on the Greek original but transplanted into a fantasy setting. The novel treats her sympathetically, giving her interiority and desires beyond her guardian function, and ultimately allows her to find a solution to her own riddle, freeing herself from the role imposed on her. This represents a significant shift. The monster granted agency, allowed to transcend her mythological constraints. In visual media, the Sphinx appears in Ray Harryhausen's 1963 film Jason and the Argonauts, though only in the background as a statue. A more direct adaptation came in the 1968 Italian film Oedipus Rex, directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini. Pasolini's Sphinx is unsettling and minimally depicted, appearing as a strange masked figure rather than a literal hybrid monster. Pasolini was less interested in spectacle than in the psychological and political dimensions of the myth, and his Sphinx functions more as a cipher, a blank surface onto which Oedipus projects his own intellect. The encounter is brief, almost anticlimactic, which may be Pasolini's point. The real monster is not the Sphinx, but the forces of fate and social structure that will destroy Oedipus. In more recent cinema, the Sphinx appears in the 2010 film Clash of the Titans and its 2012 sequel Wrath of the Titans, though these films draw more from Egyptian imagery and do not feature the riddle or the suicide. The creatures are depicted as large, leonine beasts with vaguely human faces, used primarily as visual spectacle in action sequences. They retain no connection to the original myth beyond superficial appearance. The Sphinx has also appeared in video games, often as a guardian enemy or puzzle giver. In the Assassin's Creed Odyssey 2018, set in ancient Greece, players encounter Sphinx statues and can participate in a quest involving riddles, though the riddles are multiple and the creature herself is represented only as an ancient statue, not as a living entity. The game treats the Sphinx with a degree of reverence, positioning her as part of the deep mythological history of Greece. But ultimately, she is reduced to a game mechanic, a puzzle that unlocks rewards. Across all these adaptations, a pattern emerges. The riddle is remembered, but the suicide is often omitted. The moment that makes the Greek Sphinx truly distinctive, her choice of death over defeat, is too unsettling, too uncomfortably final for many modern retellings. It disrupts the narrative satisfaction of the hero's victory. It suggests that the monster's inner life, her sense of purpose and identity, mattered. And so modern versions often end with Oedipus solving the riddle and the Sphinx simply vanishing, flying away, or being destroyed by external force. The creature is denied her own agency even in death. What has been lost in this evolution is the Sphinx's original complexity. She was never merely a monster. She was a test, a threshold, a manifestation of divine will, and ultimately a tragic figure in her own right. She chose her own end rather than submit to a world where she had been proven fallible. That act of self-destruction, born of absolute conviction and absolute defeat, is what separates her from every other monster in Greek mythology. And it is precisely that act that modern retellings seem least able to incorporate. Perhaps because we have lost the cultural framework that made such a choice comprehensible. The riddle of the Sphinx. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, 3 in the evening, endures because it speaks to something universal, the human life cycle, the progression from helplessness to power to decline. But its answer, man, has taken on new resonances in an age of rapidly changing definitions of what it means to be human. We live in an era of transhumanism, artificial intelligence, genetic modification, and debates over personhood that extend beyond the boundaries of our species. The Sphinx's riddle, which once seemed to offer a stable definition of humanity grounded in biological development, now feels almost quaint. What walks on 4 legs, 2 legs, 3 legs, a human child, adult and elder? But what of those who never walk at all? What of intelligence that never has legs? What of beings that transcend or reject the linear progression of biological life? The Sphinx, in this reading, becomes a figure of essentialist thinking, a guardian of categories that are themselves under assault. Her riddle assumes a single answer, a universal truth about human nature. When Oedipus answers man, he is not just solving a puzzle. He is affirming a particular vision of what humanity is, one grounded in embodied experience and inevitable decline. The Sphinx accepts this answer and dies, but one might imagine a different ending in a contemporary retelling. A Sphinx who rejects the answer, who argues that it is too narrow, too limited, too bound to a particular time and place. What walks on 4 legs, 2 legs, 3 legs? Not only humans. The riddle, like the creature who posed it, may not survive confrontation with the complexities of the present. But there is another, darker reading available. The Sphinx's suicide can be understood, not as the death of certainty, but as the death of gatekeeping itself. She represented the principle that access to knowledge, to power, to the city, must be earned through demonstration of wisdom. She was meritocracy incarnate, deadly and uncompromising. When Oedipus answered correctly, he proved himself worthy, or so the story claims. But we know, because we have the larger myth, that Oedipus's wisdom is superficial. He can answer a riddle about human nature in the abstract, but he cannot see the truth about himself. He solves the Sphinx's question and walks into Thebes to commit incest and patricide, fulfilling prophecy. The Sphinx's riddle did not actually test wisdom. It tested cleverness, pattern recognition, the ability to think metaphorically. And those qualities, while valuable, are not the same as self-knowledge, not the same as genuine understanding. The Sphinx's death, then, is the death of a particular kind of test. A recognition that the guardians we set at our thresholds may be asking the wrong questions. We celebrate Oedipus for his intelligence, but his intelligence leads him into catastrophe. The city of Thebes rewards him with a crown and a queen, and the reward is poison. The Sphinx dies, and the city rots from within. Perhaps the monster's role was not to keep out the unworthy, but to keep in the cursed. Perhaps her riddle was meant to fail, to allow precisely the wrong person to pass, because the gods had already decided Thebes' fate. In this reading, the Sphinx is not a guardian but a tragic witness, forced to participate in a divine plan she cannot alter, and her suicide is an act of despair, a refusal to continue playing a role in a rigged game. Modern theorists of knowledge and power, from Michel Foucault to Gayatri Spivak, might see the Sphinx as a figure of epistemological violence. She who determines what knowledge counts, who is allowed to know, and who must be excluded. Her riddle is not neutral. It privileges a particular kind of abstract, linguistic thinking over other forms of intelligence. A traveler might be skilled, compassionate, brave, practical, but if they cannot pass a metaphorical riddle, they die. The Sphinx's gatekeeping is arbitrary in its content, absolute in its enforcement, and ultimately self-defeating. This is the paradox of all gatekeeping. The gatekeeper becomes so invested in the sanctity of the gate that they forget what lies beyond it, what they are ostensibly protecting. When we contrast the Greek Sphinx with her Egyptian namesake, we are also contrasting two fundamentally different relationships to knowledge and power. The great Sphinx of Giza sits in eternal silence, asking nothing, offering nothing. It is a monument to permanence, to the endurance of power across millennia. It does not test because it does not need to. Its very existence is the test. Can you build something that lasts? She exists to be overcome. She poses a riddle that can be solved, and once it is solved, she dies. She is the embodiment of challenge and failure, not endurance. This difference reflects the societies that created them. Egypt, at the height of its pharaonic power, built structures intended to last forever, to defy time itself. The pyramids, the temples, the Sphinx, all speak to a civilization confident in its permanence. Greece, by contrast, was a world of city-states in constant conflict, of democracies that rose and fell, of heroes who won glory and met early deaths. The Greek Sphinx belongs to this world. She is not built to last. She is built to kill or be defeated. And when she is defeated, she vanishes. There is something profoundly Greek in this. The recognition that even monsters, even divine instruments, are mortal and fallible. In our own moment, we might see the Sphinx as a figure of an older epistemic order being confronted by forces it cannot comprehend. She has her riddle, her single question, and for centuries it was enough. But then someone comes along who can answer it, and the entire structure collapses. This is the fate of all systems built on a single test, a single criterion for inclusion or exclusion. Eventually, someone learns the answer, disseminates it, and the gate ceases to function. The Sphinx's suicide is the suicide of gatekeeping in the age of information. Once the riddle is answered, once the secret is out, the guardian has no purpose. She cannot adapt, cannot change the riddle, cannot renegotiate the terms. She can only die. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of the myth, the recognition that knowledge, once it spreads, cannot be contained. The Sphinx thought her riddle was unique, insoluble, a perfect instrument of division between the worthy and the unworthy. But knowledge is social, cumulative. Oedipus answered the riddle, and from that moment, anyone could know the answer. The Sphinx could not survive in a world where her mystery had been solved, where her power had been demystified. She is the embodiment of esoteric knowledge confronted by exoteric dissemination, and she chooses oblivion. We live in an age where information has never been more accessible, and truth has never felt more elusive. The Sphinx's riddle was clear, its answer definitive. Our riddles are murkier, our answers contested. We have more gatekeepers than ever. Algorithms, credentialing bodies, platforms, institutions, and fewer shared agreements about what knowledge is valid, or who is authorized to possess it. The Sphinx at least had the integrity to die when her authority was undermined. Our gatekeepers simply recalibrate, shift the goalposts, rewrite the riddle. But standing at that narrow pass outside Thebes, before the winged woman with lion's claws and unblinking eyes, the question remains. Not the riddle about morning, noon, and evening, the deeper question. What are you willing to risk to pass the threshold? What will you sacrifice to gain knowledge, to enter the city, to claim your place? And when you answer the riddle, when you solve the problem, overcome the obstacle, prove yourself worthy, will you find that the reward was worth the price? Or will you discover, like Oedipus, that the gate should never have been opened at all? The bones crunch underfoot. The sun rises over Thebes, and somewhere, on a cliff, no one can quite locate on any map, a creature with a woman's face and a lion's body falls into darkness, choosing the void over failure, silence over the world that has moved past her. If you enjoyed this, Hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.